to welcome Sarah Lilly for her defense, and to everybody that could make it today. In addition to her committee, it's lovely to have additional people here on the last day of finals week in the afternoon. And especially welcome to Sarah's dad and grandmother for coming all the way from Colorado, so it's lovely for you to be here. Sarah's thesis is titled "The Effect of Rhythm and Melody on Language Development and Sensory Organization in Children with Autism." Sarah comes to this thesis through her undergraduate degree in music education from the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. And then she, I'm suspecting her interest in autism emerged when she worked as a para in the Boulder Valley School District before her first teaching job here in Kansas City at Sunny Point Elementary in Blue Springs, where she works with typically developing children in the music education program, inclusion for children with autism, but also some specialized instruction for some of the children with autism in her classes. So, take it away, Sarah.
Okay. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. As Dr. Hansen-Abramight said, my project is titled "The Effect of Rhythm and Melody on the Language Development of Sensory Organization for Children with Autism." And the reason that I chose to discuss this and investigate this was that the newest statistics that have just recently come out in the last few weeks suggest that 1 in 88 children are diagnosed with autism. And it is federal law that students cannot be excluded from public education due to a disability. A lot of music teachers are required and expected to teach this growing population, but they're not getting the training that they need to provide appropriate music educational experiences to address these needs of the children with autism. So my purpose for this project was to improve the understanding of how music could address the language and sensory needs for an individual with autism within the public music education setting. I did a very extensive review of literature that investigated 4 different areas: autism, impairments within autism, elements of music, and some neurological perspectives. So in autism, there are 3 characteristics that mark this disorder, and those 3 characteristics are impaired social interaction, impaired language development, and the presence of restricted, repetitive, stereotyped behaviors, interests, and activities. And from here on out, I'm going to refer to those as RRS behaviors. Those include things such as hand flapping or spinning or jumping. Some of the interests could be talking exclusively about trains or about mushrooms or elephants, are just a few that I've experienced with a couple of my kids. And some activities would be participating exclusively in activities, especially video games are very common. This is a spectrum disorder, which means that individuals range from being very mild in these behaviors, in this display of behaviors, to very profound in this display of behaviors. So the 2 impairments that I really looked at closely to inform my research questions were impairments in sensory organization and impairments in language. So a sensory impairment, when a typically developing individual would experience sensory input such as sound, sight, or touch, a typically developing individual would be able to modulate that input, respond appropriately, and then habituate that response. However, individuals with autism, their sensory systems are unable to modulate this input as it's coming in, to respond appropriately, and then to remember that response for later down the road. So when an individual cannot organize his or her sensory input, it's been described as a feeling of internal chaos inside the individual. And often a feeling of well-being will be sought out before higher level thinking can occur. This affects areas of an individual with autism in their adaptive behaviors, possibly within their anxiety, and within their social skills. Also within the music classroom, these behavior problems that are seen in the music classroom may actually stem from this inability to regulate sensory systems and from sensory dysfunction, opposed to the child just choosing to be bad or misbehave. Often individuals with autism cope with this feeling of organization by displaying these RRS behaviors, and research suggests that that's a way that individuals with autism are able to regulate their systems through things such as spinning and hand flapping or jumping. And then those RRS behaviors then are one of those key diagnostic qualifiers for autism. Within the spectrum of language impairments, as I stated earlier, that is a key diagnostic qualifier of the disorder. This often occurs on a spectrum. There are many individuals who are very low functioning in their language abilities, and that they may even be nonverbal, to very high functioning where their language skills are very high, but they may lack appropriate use of speech, especially in social situations. Two of the areas that I really looked at to inform my research questions were the area of auditory perception and prosody. Auditory perception is the process of following sounds from a sequence. So that would be the following sounds together to form words, and words together to form sentences. Research suggests that individuals with autism may actually passively listen to speech, in that auditory perception and the auditory information is being registered in the brain, but they're choosing not to orient towards it or listen to it in an appropriate way. It's also been suggested that there may even be a possible aversion to those speech sounds for the individuals with autism. Other research has suggested that possibly novel tones might better catch the attention than speech sounds would for an individual with autism, and that orientation towards a sound stimulus might be better for non-speech sounds such as a musical toy rather than a social speech sound such as calling a child's name. Prosody is an element of language that is the emphasis, pitch accenting, rhythm, and intonation of our speech. This is a byproduct of our language, though. It's not a construct around which our language is built. The speech comes forth, and the speech is kind of just naturally organized by us. It's not something that we actively pursue to organize our speech around, and that's important for a little later. So two elements of music that I really explored were rhythm and melody. In rhythm, we have rhythm both in language and in music. And as I said earlier, the rhythm of our language is prosody. However, as I said earlier, this is perceptually adaptive, and it's a byproduct of our language. So it's not organized well across that's easily perceived for a listener to hear. Within music, though, rhythm is a unique element of organization that can be easily heard, and rhythm is a construct on which our music can be based. Research suggests that attention can be more readily allocated when events occur within a temporal and predictable system. And music might be able to provide this predictable temporal system, and it may offer an internal sense of rhythm for an individual with autism who is experiencing chaos within their own sensory systems. Again, the prosody is also present in our language, melody is also present in our language in prosody. And as I said earlier, there's no strong sense of organization within our melody with our pitch intervals and our emphasis and our intonation of going up and down within our language. It's not constant, and research even suggests that frequency can vary across different speakers or even within the sentences of a same speaker. However, in music, there is a very strong sense of organization around a tonal center. And it's been said that the tonal center can actually act as a perceptual gravitational pull which people can organize the music around. Research has even suggested that there may even be a tonal hierarchy system, whereas the third and the fifth are more perceived to be related to that tonal center than the other pitches within a musical scale. This strong set of perceptual relations, again, may be able to help an individual with autism organize his or her sentences and organize language with these things that are constant, that stay organized within music, opposed to in language where it's very unorganized. So some neurological research in sensory systems, music, language, and autism might also suggest that there is a theoretical framework to connect music to the development of language and sensory systems for an individual with autism. Two of these theories that I looked at were the theories of weak central coherence and the theories of temporal binding. These two theories, they're both just theories, but they both kind of suggest and work together to suggest that processing within the local networks of the brain may be intact for an individual with autism, but the integration of new information between these local networks may be impaired. It's been suggested that these neural networks are not communicating across the brain, so higher level thinking cannot occur when the information is stagnated within the brain. This has also been looked at in an area of brain measurement activity called the gamma band. It has been suggested that individuals with autism may display an abnormal measurement of this brain activity of the gamma band, and that this may be what is causing that information to not flow throughout the brain. However, the interesting thing is that research suggests that the gamma band might actually reflect expectancies for pulse, meter, and also respond to outside temporal stimuli. So what that means is that the gamma band might actually be able to be influenced by outside rhythm, which then might help these neural networks communicate across the brain so that individuals with autism might be able to process information globally across the brain in order to facilitate higher level thinking. Research in the area of the brain of an individual with autism suggests that there may be structural, functional, and developmental differences in the brain of an individual with autism compared to a typically developing individual. And the two areas that I really looked closely at were the areas of hemispheric differences and differences within the corpus callosum. So our brain is divided into two hemispheres, and those different hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, they process different types of information. For a typically developing individual, language is processed in the left hemisphere of the brain. However, research is suggesting that there may be a reversed hemispheric dominance in language processing. So what that means is that individuals with autism might be processing language in the right side of their brain, whereas typically developing individuals are processing language in the left side of the brain. Interestingly enough, research is also suggesting that music, and especially the elements of melody and rhythm, are processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. So when language might be processed in the right side of the brain for an individual with autism, and music might be processed in the right side of the brain for an individual with autism, these two things might be able to correlate and work together to help facilitate language through music. The corpus callosum, it's a nerve fiber that goes down the center of your brain that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. This helps aid in the communication between the two hemispheres of the brain so that information can be shared bilaterally across the two hemispheres. For individuals with autism, it's suggested that there is a smaller volume of the corpus callosum than there is for typically developing individuals. Now, musicians it's been suggested that their corpus callosum is actually thicker, and musical training for children might increase the size of this corpus callosum. So if we could train or use music for individuals with autism, I'm curious as to whether or not this could increase the size of the corpus callosum, which then could help in the processing throughout the brain for individuals with autism. So this information led me to 4 different research questions, and those research questions were, does rhythm-based speech enhance sensory organization more effectively than conversational speech for children with autism spectrum disorders? The second one, does rhythm-based speech plus melody enhance sensory organization more effectively than conversational speech and rhythm alone? Does rhythm-based speech enhance language production more effectively than conversational speech for children with autism spectrum disorders? And does rhythm-based speech plus melody enhance language production more effectively than conversational speech and rhythm alone? So for our methodology, each participant served as his own control and a counterbalance design that was randomized for the first condition. So for my participants, I recruited 5 individuals from the school that I teach, and so this was a convenience sample. 4 of the children were able to complete all of the sessions. 1 of the children did not complete the last session due to an illness. The children were aged 5 to 9, and they had an educational diagnosis of autism, and they were served on an IEP within this school. Our measures that we used, we were trying to measure sensory organization and language in 3 conditions. So our independent variables were conversational speech, rhythmic speech, and rhythmic speech plus melody. And our dependent variables were in the areas of sensory organization and language. So for sensory organization, we were measuring the presence or absence of unrelated vocal noises and inappropriate hand, head, or body movements. In language, we were measuring gestures, vocalizations, single word utterances, and multiple word utterances. And there were 2 data collectors that served as my data collectors, and they did naturalistic observation, and they were both familiar with the participants. So this is what the data collection tool looked like for the sensory organization, the RRS behaviors. We measured hand, head, body, and unrelated vocal noises within a pre-test, an intervention, and a post-test. And so if one of those things would occur, the data collector would just make a tally. And the language data collection tool looks very similar, but we were measuring for gestures, vocalizations, single word utterances, and multiple word utterances. So our protocol, we used the individual growth development indicators and the early communication indicator as a basis for we used the early communication indicator as a basis for our data collection. We had 3 different sessions that we measured. We had a pre-test free play that lasted for 2 minutes, an intervention which lasted for 2 minutes, and a post-test free play. So within the pre-test, I sat down with the children around a Fisher-Price toy barn, and I gave them guided questions that they could answer, such as, what does the sheep do, or what does the cow do, or which animal is your favorite, or where do the animals live? And that helped them play with the barn in a way that we could observe their natural free play. Then the intervention happened and occurred for 2 minutes. I developed matched sentences for each condition, so there were 6 sentences total, and each sentence was delivered for 1 minute during the intervention. So here's what the sentences looked like. And you can see the first 2 sentences were for the conversational speech, the next 2 were for the rhythmic speech, and the last 2 were for the melodic and rhythmic speech, or melodic speech. You can see just by the colors how it winds up and that they're very matched. We worked really hard to make sure that the sentences were grammatically the same and about the same amount of words, so that there wouldn't be that wouldn't be a limitation of the study. Then to create the melodies and the rhythms for these sentences, what I did was for the 3rd and 4th sentences, so for the rhythmic sentences, and for the 5th and 6th sentences, the melodic sentences, I had 3 different individuals speak the sentences that I recorded. So as they spoke them, they were reading them, and I recorded it into a microphone. I then went back and really tried to closely match the natural prosody of the rhythm and the inflections of the voice. So if there was a large inflection, then I would make a large melodic leap. If the speech tended to, the inflection tended to go down, then I would have the melody go down. And I tried to match the natural rhythms of the speech too. So in doing that, here's the 2 rhythmic sentences and the way that they looked, and then the 2 melodic sentences with the melody notated. So in the delivery schedule, one condition was presented on 3 separate days across a single week, which was then followed by the other 2 conditions in subsequent weeks. So there was a total of 9 sessions that lasted 3 weeks. So our results, for data analysis, we conducted, because there were multiple dependent variables, we conducted a one-way MANOVA test, and the results for that were not significant. The p equaled 0.56, so that is not significant statistically. We did a couple of other descriptive analysis tests. We looked at the percent of change from pretest to post-test, and we also looked at the intervention means. So we wanted to see if between the pretest and the post-test, if there was a change in these behaviors. And you can see this is the language. It went down, just the percent of change went down just a little bit in speech. The language production went up a little bit in rhythm, and the language production went down in melody. There was a little bit of a decrease in the RRS behaviors across speech, rhythm, and melody, but it wasn't enough of a percentage that we felt that we needed to do further analysis. For the mean scores, we wanted to really make sure, or find out what was happening as I was presenting these melodic conditions and these rhythmic conditions and these speech conditions. So we took the mean scores of just that intervention piece, and you can see that there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the 3 conditions. They were all pretty much about the same in their means, so we didn't do any further data analysis. So, results indicated that rhythmic-based speech or rhythmic speech plus melody did not enhance the sensory organization or language production more effectively than conversational speech alone for children with autism. However, there was a few things that happened during the study that I think are really important to note. So after each session, I just took some observational data of what occurred during the sessions. In the melodic conditions, there was a lot of really interesting stuff that happened. One of the things that happened was participants A and B actually created their own melodic sentences as they were free playing, or as I was with some of the other animals that I wasn't using in the melodic conditions. So for participant B, he actually got, his order of the conditions was melody, speech, and then rhythm. So the first week I gave him melody. Then the second week in the speech condition, I presented him the goat. And I said, the goat lives on the farm. The goat likes to jump and play. And he said back, and I said, can you say it? And he said, the goat lives on the farm. And he reflected that melody that we had used in the sheep, for the sheep in the melodic condition. And as I kept saying it back to him conversationally, he kept singing it back to me. No matter if I kept saying it conversationally and speaking it, he would then sing it back to me. Participant A actually just made up his own melodies during his free play for a lot of the different animals. So I'd give him the melodic intervention, and then I'd say, what does the sheep do? Or, I'm sorry, something, what does the cow do? The cow wasn't a melodic condition. And he would say, the cow eats all the grass, or something along those lines. So he would sing something back to me, even though I hadn't given him any sort of sung condition for that particular animal. I also really noticed that repetition was a lot better in the melodic conditions than in the spoken or rhythmic conditions. Participant E in particular is a very interesting subject. He was a much lower on the spectrum than any of the other participants. He's almost nonverbal. He makes a lot of noises, but there's very little attempt at actual speech that we perceive. And so he would not repeat at all anything in the spoken conditions. When I try and get him to repeat something, he wouldn't give me anything. On the rhythmic conditions, he would give me one word. When I said, the pig likes to roll in the, he would fill in mud. And so I got one word out of that. However, when I gave him a prompt, the sheep, he filled in, lives on the farm. So he wouldn't give me anything at all in conversational, just a little bit in rhythmic, filled in a whole big chunk for the melodic conditions. So I thought that that was really interesting and very important to discuss. Also, another interesting thing was the prosody within this study. A lot of one of the children in particular, participant C, he has very little inflection in his regular speaking voice. However, if in that melodic condition he didn't feel like he got a big enough leap from the sheep, he would stop and start again and try and get that really big inflection for that prosody that if you remember, I really tried to mirror the natural prosody of language, so that he was really adamant about getting that prosody within the melodic sentences. Also, participant B would use his whole body within the melodic to show where the inflection in the melodic line was going. So I thought that that was just some really interesting stuff that happened just with the melody. I talked a little bit earlier about auditory perception and how previous research suggests that there's passive listening, a possible aversion to speech sounds, and that orientation is better towards non-speech stimuli for individuals with autism. The anecdotal evidence from this study might support those things. The individuals with autism that I used really, the melodic speech really caught their attention, I think, more than the other ones. There would always be a sharp change of focus from whatever they were doing as soon as I started to sing. They would make eye contact with me. That's something that we didn't measure, was eye contact, that I think should be measured in other studies if this is replicated. And also just in the fact that the melody was more readily repeated may suggest that there was more active listening going on during those melodic conditions. I want to just explore a couple of little things with participant E again. I went through and looked at just the percent of change in his language scores over the 3 different conditions. And if you remember, I said that he doesn't have a lot of very functional speech. It's a lot of vocalizations that aren't organized in a way that we can understand them. So if you look here, in the speech, his production of language went up. In the rhythm, it went down just a little bit, but then in the melodic conditions, the percent of change dropped dramatically. And I thought that was interesting, so I went back and looked specifically at the vocalization scores. And you can see that for the speech, the percent of change, the vocalizations went up. For rhythm, they went up a little bit more, but then in melody, his vocalizations dropped dramatically. So what might have happened there is that he was able to organize his speech a little better to reduce those vocalizations and possibly be working more towards that more quality of speech than just the vocalizations. So going forward, there's 2 different things that I think that is important. The first is to look at how this affects music educators, as I am one, and also where future studies should go with this information. If the anecdotal evidence really does suggest that auditory perception and orientation do increase for children with autism, then the music classroom is a natural environment to enforce language through music. There is a process of musical education that already exists that really marries language and music together, and that's the ORF process. It's been said that this is a marriage of rhythm and language, and that rhythm and melody are really used to incorporate language in the rhythmic playing of instruments, spoken ostinati, and singing. So for a music educator who might have a high population of children with autism, if you do want to look at how those language skills might develop, the ORF process is a very natural way that's already in existence to really help with those language skills. Also, I really think that in future studies there's some things that need to be looked at. And the first thing is, how can you measure auditory perception in this? I don't have an answer to that yet, but I think that that's definitely an important element. Also, with the prosody, as I was talking about, great care was really taking care for those composition of those melodies and those rhythms. And the individuals really worked to do that prosody from that melody. And so I'm wondering if by taking that natural prosody of language and putting it into a musical setting, if that could then help train the prosodic perception and production for individuals with autism. And last, the thing that really needs to be looked at is how you measure the quality of language and where this intervention language that I'm presenting occurs and is used within the free play sessions. We didn't think about looking at that, just the quality of language. We just measured a vocalization or a single word utterance. Was that a quality speech, or was it just, you know, a vocalization? So how does that differ from just regular speech? So all in all, even though there wasn't a statistical significance, I really think there's some important things that this study informed that could help inform future studies. Thank you.
So we'll take about 10 minutes or so if anybody has questions or comments that they would like to ask of Sarah. And then that will end the public defense piece, and then the committee will meet with Sarah for a little bit and ask her some other questions. Anybody have questions, comments?
Well, Sarah, first of all, congratulations on a beautifully designed and implemented study. I think it's an important piece of work that will serve, it will have a beautiful ripple effect for the profession. One thing that seems inherent in the design that means that your results are not at all surprising is that since you had a convenient sample of just 5 children, then if one wants to generalize for group truth, and if it's already virtually impossible, but then the other issue would be, I think you said that differences of children, impairments of children or others with autism are inherently very individualized. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to that for a minute? If you were able to do this same procedure and collect the same sort of data with 5,000 children, can you speak to that? Mm-hmm. Would we be able to find something generalizable?
I can't say for sure whether we would or not. However, I think something that would be important is to match children on their language skills. So
okay.
I had a list of where the skills of these children were, like age-appropriate skills that our speech pathologist gave me on where their language abilities lie. Some of them were at the age of 1 and some of them were at the age of 6. So that is a very broad spectrum of language skills. So if we were to have 5,000 children, I would really want to make sure that those children were matched on their language abilities. And just on, and I don't know how you would match this exactly, possibly on a baseline of sensory behaviors, because again, these one thing that I didn't mention, but that I didn't really think about, is there's actually 3 profiles of sensory dysfunction, and that's understimulation, overstimulation, and sensory seeking behaviors. I was really only looking at those sensory seeking behaviors. However, 2 of the children specifically were very much on the understimulation, in that there's a lot that needs to happen to create, they have a very high threshold of sensory input. And so they may not have, they don't have the same sensory dysfunction as participant E did, where he's just all over the place all the time with those sensory seeking behaviors. So matching that more closely with language and sensory behaviors, I think, would be important.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. The discussion you had about the hemispheric shift, is that the right terminology?
Yeah, reversed hemispheric dominance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds smarter.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the language the language processing piece tends to be shifted to the left side. Mm-hmm. Do other processes shift to the other side, or it just kind of joins the party on the right side?
I don't know, and that's something that I wasn't able to find any research on. It might be that music for individuals with autism also shifts to the other side. Mm-hmm. It might be that it doesn't. I wasn't able to find anything specifically that had looked especially at children. There's a lot in the field of brain traumatic injury and how music is processed and where it's processed, but I haven't seen I personally have not seen anything on where music is processed in the brain for individuals with autism.
So, based on the question that Dr. Robinson gave and your clear passion for individuals that have this sort of disorder, these sorts of disorders, this sounds like this is the beginning of a lifelong quest to create and solve these questions.
It could very well be.
And I hope that that is in fact the case, because the world's going to be a whole lot better if we can figure this out.
I agree.
So.
Yes.
Yeah, a couple things. Music therapy, we often use transitional kind of modes in between in our session plans. And often with kids with autism or little younger kids will sing. It just keeps their attention. And just even with toddlers, just kind of magic compared to just speaking at them. So that's kind of interesting. There's probably, I don't know if there's any research on that. Just
I haven't seen anything specifically on that, but I haven't looked very carefully for that either.
And the other aspect is socio-cultural. So rhythmic speech is akin to rap and hip-hop, that kind of thing. So I don't know what the background of your comedian sample was, but within that, I just wonder if there'd be some changes between melodic and rhythmic in a different kind of culture.
It's really interesting.
I have one follow-up too. I'm fascinated by the prosody, and I think you wisely talk about the importance of measuring that. Could you imagine, would it be overkill, do you think, or advisable to try to measure that more quantitatively, like with a spectrograph or something? Would that be helpful, or is it just like, no, that's overkill?
I really don't know. It might be helpful. I think there needs to be something that is measuring prosody, but I don't know what that tool would be.
I guess it would be some sort of spectral analysis of the vocalizations.
I'm thinking you already addressed very honestly just the inherent subjectivity of your data collection process, and you wished you could have videotaped and that didn't happen. But even then, if we go back and watch videotapes, we're still sort of saying, it seems like I'm hearing something,
Right.
which is maybe helpful, but that's why I asked.
Yeah.
So we need money to do those sorts of tests, but I think that's where we probably, and Sarah and I talked a lot about this, the measurements we knew that going in, we're really going to limit what we could find out. But I think once we can do some things like spectral analysis, that will really, and doing digital recording and those sorts of things, and we talked about all those things, and the school district was not going to let us do anything that would provide a record of the behaviors. So, because it would have been lovely to be able to digitally record what was happening, and then we could have done spectral analysis for the lifelong.
Is there like a center, or are there centers for autism, research on autism? Like if you want to study this particular concept, is there one place you go, like Germany or Boston or Eudora or what? I mean, is there a center for? I'm astounded if there isn't one.
Well, I think there are smaller, like KU Med has their Center for Children with Disabilities. They do a lot of work with children with autism.
Because all these things that you're talking about, in 40 minutes, are like if we could develop a catalog of vocalizations, if we could develop a catalog of prosody, if we could develop a database of different reactions of different locations on the spectrum, and how is that not done yet?
Well, and I think one of the most beautiful things of your study, Sarah, is the review of literature. and it speaks to what you're saying too, because you have a theoretical framework unlike anything I have seen in publications on music and children with autism. Everything that you did in your methodology was supported, and the rationale was there because of the emerging theories, or what was happening neurologically, or what was happening with language and neurology. So I think that's why we haven't had a lot of great progress with music and music education or music therapy. We're kind of still regurgitating the same information over and over again. But here you have this beautiful review of literature that strongly supports what you did and why you did it.
And I think too, I have no idea why this is, and I'm not going to try and argue it, but as these numbers for autism go up where it was, I mean, just a few months ago they were saying 1 in 110, and within the last few weeks they're saying 1 in 88, and before that, like, it was, 1 in 250, and before that, I mean, it's just, these numbers are rising, and as these numbers are continuing to rise, I think that there will be some more interest in it, but, before it was just kind of, that, whereas now this thing is rising, and it really does need to be explored.
So do you think that the numbers are